What's up, nerds? Israel has begun its operation in Rafah, and the United States is very much not thrilled about it. So let's talk about what has happened so far. Let's talk about the Israeli movement into Rafah and what exactly it has looked like thus far. We're going to talk about the U.S. reaction to this operation, and we're going to talk about why that reaction is. Then we're going to talk about what might come next. And I'm recording this video on the 10th of May, 2024. Now, of course, first off, Israel began its operation in Rafah on May 7th. They seized the border crossing with Egypt, and they appear to be moving into Rafah proper right now. Now, this appears to be a much more slower and careful operation than what we've seen in other places. They're kind of moving east to west from the Israeli border towards the Mediterranean Sea, and they're trying to push civilians towards Khan Yunis, where they've set up some refugee camps, basically where they can offer shelter, food, and water. Before the operation, they dropped leaflets basically telling Palestinians, hey, move in that direction, we're coming in, and basically gave them a 24-hour warning before they kicked off the operation. Now, they did briefly pause humanitarian aid through the Egypt to Gaza border crossing due to rocket attacks. However, it appears that is now reopened. However, it has still been targeted by rockets from Hamas since then. Now, this has been a long discussed operation. We've talked about this operation coming up for a few months on this channel and some other videos, and I've waited really a few days till after this operation kicked off because I wanted to wait and see what the U.S. response would be. But basically, I knew that there would be drama. I knew that the drama wouldn't necessarily kick off immediately, so I wanted to wait, kind of brew some tea, and watch the fireworks. I will say that we've also gotten some footage from the IDF in this operation, and the footage from the IDF that we've gotten really throughout this war have really kind of flown in the face of the idea that the IDF is in its entirely a professional military organization. There was a video of the destruction of the I Heart Rafah sign, just no military necessity to that whatsoever. We've seen other videos from the IDF of other destruction of just property and infrastructure in general with, again, no real military necessity. A lot of it just seems petty and unprofessional, and that's really not what we expected at the start of the war from the IDF. But I want to kind of start with this conversation about professionalism and the lack of professionalism in the IDF, because I think that that's going to be part of the conversation whenever we talk about the U.S. response and really what that means. Now, like I said already, the biggest challenge in this operation is going to be the movement of civilians. And we've talked about what the IDF is doing to move those civilians really to the northwest, where they can receive shelter, food, and water. Of course, the U.S. is still in the process of setting up that temporary port in Gaza that will facilitate the inflow of seaborne aid. But that has not only come under attack, but it's also going to take some time for that to become operational. So this operation in Rafah is really happening at a time where the civilians aren't necessarily able to get the breadth of the humanitarian aid that they really need. And fighting around the Rafah border crossing, where some humanitarian aid tends to come through, that's going to be a bit of a challenge logistically to get aid to these people. Now, what Israel has said is that the goal for this operation is to capture or kill the remainder of the Hamas leadership. And by remainder, I pretty much mean all of the Hamas leadership, because they haven't really gotten anybody really that important so far in this war. However, it's not likely that this operation is actually going to destroy the Hamas. Rafah has been kind of billed as the last bastion of, the last stronghold of Hamas in this war. But we've seen Hamas already operating in other parts of Gaza yesterday. They've managed to proliferate back into Gaza City and Khan Yunis and some of these places that the IDF has largely withdrawn from. So if the IDF takes Rafah, it's not necessarily going to make much difference strategically, because Hamas has managed to leave the confines of Rafah already at this point. However, with the humanitarian complexity of this operation and with the kind of the scope of what needs to happen in this operation, this will likely take at least several weeks to potentially some months. Now, prior to this operation, a ceasefire had been agreed to. However, let's talk about what the ceasefire is, because those of you that have looked at the terms of this ceasefire and kind of looked at how the ceasefire was agreed to, you'll kind of see that it's a fairly lopsided deal. It's mostly Israeli concessions in Gaza. Hamas doesn't really have to give up anything except for a handful of hostages. Many of those hostages that Hamas have taken are already believed to have passed away, and Israel was neither involved in the negotiation nor a signatory to the ceasefire agreement. There was a delegation left in Cairo to continue to negotiate. However, yesterday on May 9th, those talks appeared to have spun out, and the Israeli and the U.S. delegations have left. A ceasefire would end the Rafah operation really at any point once it's agreed to. However, I'm not holding my breath. It doesn't look like a ceasefire agreement is around the corner at all. It doesn't look like either side it really wants to budge from their demands. Hamas is wanting a complete IDF withdrawal from Gaza and a return to the pre-war borders, and the IDF is wanting a complete dismantling of Hamas, and as well as the release of the remaining hostages, even those that have been killed. Neither are likely to happen anytime soon without some sort of massive break. Now, with this operation kicking off, like I said before at the beginning of this video, the U.S. is not very excited about this operation happening, and President Biden had warned Benjamin Netanyahu prior to this operation from happening, basically saying that the humanitarian concerns are too great and that the IDF really should refrain from going into Rafah, and that it would potentially cause some problems with Egypt. We've talked about the level of alertness that the Egyptian military has been at in the Sinai. They're very concerned about this war going on. They're concerned about the humanitarian catastrophe impacting them as well. And they're also concerned with the Israeli control over the Rafah side of the Philadelphia corridor, where the border crossing there. So these are important details that the IDF appears to just kind of think, oh, we don't care. We're going in anyway. Now, once the operation in Rafah actually began, U.S. support for Israel paused. But I'm actually going to add some caveats to this because it's not all aid to Israel. The administration paused offensive aid to Israel while it reviews whether or not the aid that it's actually sending to Israel is necessary. Now, this doesn't, the aid that's being paused does not include defensive munitions like the Iron Dome interceptors or, anything that they need to be able to defend against rocket and missile attacks and other kinds of threats. What it does include is offensive weapons, which include JDAMs, the 2,000-pound bombs that Israel has been dropping like Kendrick Lamar albums. They've been just absolutely devastating in the Gaza Strip. They've killed tens of thousands of civilians, and that has become a huge controversy in the Israeli operation. Of course, as you can imagine, pausing any kind of aid to Israel drew a lot of criticism, not only from Israel, but also from Republicans. Some Israeli leaders saying that Biden loves Hamas or Hamas loves Biden, which I think is a strong statement because, again, Biden's not pausing all aid to Israel, and for all we know, it's really just a temporary pause. Other critics are saying that this emboldens Israel's enemies and Hamas. I think that these criticisms are really, honestly, just a little disingenuous, though. It lacks context around the decision. And let's take an example with JDAMs, the 2,000-pound bombs that have been absolutely devastating the Gaza Strip. The U.S. used these JDAMs pretty sparingly in the fight against ISIS because, again, these are pretty freaking massive bombs. They can lead to a lot of collateral damage. And if you're not abundantly sure that those buildings are empty and really that they are a necessary military target in a counterinsurgency war, you don't really drop them. You've got smaller bombs. You don't have to drop the biggest thing you've got just because you have it. Israel, however, has been dropping them just willy-nilly, just slinging them around like candy. It doesn't matter. They've got plenty of JDAMs because they know that the faucet continues to drop from the United States. And that's a huge reason why the impact to civilians from this war has been so intense, because the bombs that Israel is using are just way larger than they really need to be. Turns out if you drop a 2,000-pound bomb in the middle of a massive city block that's densely populated and full of civilians, a lot of innocent people will die. Who would have guessed? I know I would not have guessed that. So thank you, Israel, for taking on that experiment. But I think this takes us back to the conversation of professionalism within the IDF. It doesn't take an expert to assess that the damage from these bombs is greatly larger than really what's necessary to go after these targets, and that a 2,000-pound bomb tends to create collateral damage. A professional military would see that and then kind of reconsider its fire package and maybe moderate its fires a little bit. Maybe use some smaller explosives, maybe more precise explosives to go after militants, or even more precise operations. Maybe not dropping a bomb and instead sending in soldiers. And they did send in soldiers, but instead of sending in their troops to go after these militants, in an urban environment, trying to reduce the impact on civilian casualties, they basically bombed a whole lot of infrastructure, and the troops went in over a lot of rubble. Now, there's the argument from the critics over this decision that Israel needs these JDAMs to defend itself. The JDAMs are not the only way for Israel to do so. And this argument basically exists in a world where Iron Dome doesn't exist anymore. I think that that's a real shame because I was really starting to like the Iron Dome. It's a shame that that just disappeared. And even then, even with this pause, Israel already has enough stockpiled JDAMs and munitions that it needs to complete the Rafah operation. So it's not like this is going to impact Israel. It's really a public political decision. It's practically speaking, it's too little too late. Now, right now with the operation, all eyes are on Egypt and some of the other regional actors and how they will react to this operation. Like I've said before, Hamas very well might survive this whole ordeal. What Israel chooses to do about that fact, I think, is an open question that we'll just have to wait and see on. Israel is tightening the border between Gaza and Israel, creating a buffer zone. They're creating a no-man zone between Gaza and Israel. They're including Israeli control over the Egypt border crossing, which is a very important detail that we've already discussed. That was not something that Israel wanted to see. So the developments from this conflict, really nobody wanted to see. Hezbollah remains in the north, of course. Things appear to have calmed down, at least for now, since the little, spat between Israel and Iran, which is a good thing, but we don't know how long exactly that's going to last. Internal political pressure continues to mount Netanyahu, especially with not only this war in Gaza continuing to drag on, but really with the handling from Netanyahu on this war and on some of the other conflicts going on. Now, I would anticipate that this aid to Israel will continue to flow after some time and public anger has subsided. And that includes the offensive aid that is currently being paused. Folks, we've seen that folks publicly have a very short attention span. So Biden might be attempting to look tough on Israel right now while the operation is beginning. However, once people kind of get distracted, start watching other things, Kendrick drops his next album and people are talking about that, then that'll be the time that, the faucet opens up again and more offensive aid begins to pour through. But Biden will have already won kind of that little round politically, showing that he's tough on Israel when he needs to be. If Hezbollah gets engaged again and fighting kicks off in the north again from where it had been, then pressure will probably pick up again to unlock that offensive aid, even if it hadn't been unlocked beforehand. But again, I'm not sure if or when that will happen. In either case, we've already said that pausing this aid is not going to impact the Rafah operation. They've already got everything that they need. Israel sees this operation as critical to destroying Hamas, even if they're not necessarily going to succeed in destroying Hamas in this operation. Even if a ceasefire gets agreed to, I don't necessarily assess that a ceasefire is going to stop Israel from destroying Hamas. If the terms of the ceasefire, or even if there's a peace agreement on the opposite end of that ceasefire, Israel's looking to completely dismantle Hamas, and they're going to achieve that whether they have to continue the war or if they're able to get concessions from Hamas in the peace deal that they can comprehensively destroy Hamas, through an agreement, with some other kind of actor in Gaza acting as a mediator and an enforcer to dismantle what remains of Hamas. I think the real question here, though, is what Israel will do once it's cleared Rafah and it finds that Hamas still very much exists in the rest of the Gaza Strip. Then what's going to happen? Does Gaza become a decades-long game of whack-a-mole? Where have we seen this before? It's not like a large modern army fighting an asymmetric insurgency group that appears to just pop up out of nowhere in one place, and then you go attack it there, and then it pops up in another place, and then you attack it there. This just seems like such a foreign concept. It's a real bummer that there's no experience in that. No country can actually lend any kind of advice to Israel on how to handle this situation. Once Israel finds itself in that kind of situation, do they just wave their hands and say, well, we did what we said we'd do and now we're going to go home? The whole Gaza Strip has become a real security dilemma for Israel, even more than it was before the war. They can't stop humanitarian aid from flowing in. That absolutely has to happen. There's no negotiating on that. They know that the humanitarian aid, at least in part, is being commandeered by Hamas, and some of the products from that aid is being used to create weapons, makeshift weapons that can be used against Israel. They know that they can't comprehensively destroy Hamas because they've been trying that, and to commit to destroying Hamas, they're going to have to commit their entire invasion force that they had before, potentially for years, to be able to actually succeed at that. After several months and nearly the complete destruction of the Gaza Strip, more people in Gaza are likely to be sympathetic to a group like Hamas or another kind of militant group that violently fights Israel now than they were whenever the war actually began. So what does Israel do then? Do they continue their policy of just mowing the grass, or do they have to take a more harsher stance against Gaza? And how long can they actually afford to continue to do that? And this is the real sticky point that Israel finds itself in right now, and why this operation in Rafah might just be more of a symbolic operation, might be just more political in nature, and may not really practically be to actually really comprehensively destroy Hamas. Israel has been talking about going into Rafah for some time. They've made it out to be the last bastion of Hamas. So of course they've got to go in. There's no there's no way that they're not going to do that. However, once they're done, what do? This is a nasty, complicated mess. It's messed up, and there are no easy or good paths forward. What we do know is that 2,000-pound bombs are not going to get them out of this situation or make any of this any better, because honestly, it's 2,000-pound bombs that got them in this mess in the first place. Now, with all this, I want to hear your thoughts on this. I've already said that this is complicated. Tell me that this is, tell me why you think this is complicated, or if you don't think it's that complicated, in the comments. Like this video if you found it informative and helpful, and subscribe for more analysis, not only on this war, but on the war in Ukraine and other wars that come up and other topics as well. For all that, I'll see you all next time. Later.